And one of the places, if we're talking about stress and the impact of stress, the disparate health outcomes for women, for people of color, you borrowed Dr. Kenneth Hardy's phrase, the assaulted sense of self, to point to this, one of these most insidious, harmful effects of racism, which is internalized racism.
It's the...
You talk about it physically getting under the skin.
Dr. Hardy talked about it in terms of racism. It's absolutely true. But this assaulted sense of self, where you basically take on another person's view of yourself. So you disconnect from yourself. So people who are traumatized in general take on the other person's view of themselves. They lose their own sense of themselves. Now, this is particularly true of certain racial groups in a racist society. And it has physiological consequences. So just last week there was a study that came out and said that racism affects the immune system and the nervous system and hormonal apparatus, obviously, immediately. Now in this book I document the long-term effects of all that, which is why if you look at, say, for example, the certain markers of inflammation, they're much higher in people of color than they are in many Caucasians, strictly because of racism, nothing to do with genetics. And inflammation, of course, is a risk factor for illness. So in Canada, again, to look at our indigenous population, where we used to have no rheumatoid arthritis whatsoever, none. Now an indigenous woman has 6 times the rate of rheumatoid arthritis than that of anybody else. And people of color, and particularly women of color, have much higher rates of autoimmune disease. Again, nothing to do with genetics, everything had to do with stress of that assaulted sense of self. So that, as to why women, as opposed to my women of any social class, particularly minority women, but not only, it's intersectional, isn't it? If you're a person of color and a woman, you can have more risk. Why women? Why do women have 70–80% of autoimmune disease? Rheumatoid arthritis, lupus, scleroderma, chronic fatigue, fibromyalgia, and so on. This is a big medical mystery. We're tearing our hair out and scratching our heads, what's going on here? And people come up with all these fancy theories. It's so obvious. The more stress you're under, the more likely the immune system is going to turn against you, for physiological reasons that are very easy to trace. Now, why are women under more stress? A little fact. In the 1930s, the gender ratio of multiple sclerosis was about 1:1. You know what it is now? 3 women to every man. Which immediately proves, A, it's not genetic. Genes don't change in 80 years. Number 1, it's not the climate or the diet, because that hasn't changed more for one gender than the other. What has changed is outlined in the headline of a New York Times article, which I borrowed for a chapter of my book. It's called Society's Shock Absorbers. During COVID, it was found that women take on the stresses of their families and their spouses, and they feel guilty if they're not able to ameliorate the stresses of their spouses or their families. They feel guilty. Why? Because under the patriarchy, they're given the role of being society's shock absorbers. They take on the stress of all the relationships that they're in. Now, that's been a traditional role of women under the patriarchy. But now, because of 2 factors, one is just a natural desire of women to be out there in the workforce. That's, the women's feminist movement, one of its achievements. But also because of economic pressure, because 2 people now have to work to make the same living that one person can provide some decades ago. A lot of women are out there not because they're trying to manifest their talents, but simply because they have to go to work to support their families. So in the States, 25% of women have to go back to work within 2 weeks of giving birth, which amounts to a massive abandonment of our babies. They're not doing that because they just want to express themselves through the creativity of work. They're going because economically they can't afford not to do so. That would be okay. Women going out there into the workforce whether because of for self-manifestation or because of economic necessity, might be okay if at the same time the other role of absorbing the stress was shared by the genders, but it isn't. They still have that role. And so now you double the stress, and what's happened is we're far less united and communal than we used to be. There's far less mutual support. There's far more isolation. There's a loneliness epidemic in this country. Not just in this country, in the globalized capitalist world. Britain had to appoint a minister for loneliness, for God's sakes. So more stress, more isolation, less support, triple the rate of multiple sclerosis, which the person who first described multiple sclerosis was a French physician in 1870 or 1865, I don't know when, Jean-Marie Charcot, and he said, this is a stress-driven disease. But do you think if you go to a neurologist, let me ask you this question here now. If you've been to, in the last 5 years, if you've been to a neurologist, a dermatologist, a cardiologist, a rheumatologist, an immunologist, any kind of an ologist, just raise your hand, okay? Great. Now, raise your hand again if they ask you about childhood trauma. Yeah? Raise your hand again if they ask you about stress in your life. Very few people, relatively speaking. Raise your hand if they ask you about how you feel about your marriage. Raise your hand if they ask you about how you feel about yourself as a human being. These questions all have to do with your physiology. So, on the one hand, we have this increased stress. On the other hand, we have less support. That's why we have the rising tide of chronic illnesses. Not to mention all kinds of other factors like poverty and stress-driven obesity and all kinds of other stuff. And then the junk food that we're fed. It's a conglomeration. But as far as the female-male distinction, it's because of the extra stress on women in a patriarchal culture.